What's up, YouTube, and welcome back to another episode of Homebrew Subaru. In this episode, I will be replacing a front CV shaft in this R32 Skyline. What's up, everyone? As you probably noticed from the title of the video or the thumbnail, I am going to replace this left front CV shaft in this R32 Skyline. This is actually Tyler's car. He ended up trading the Subaru that he had that I put that stage 3 block into. He traded it up against this Skyline. He's had this car for about a year now, I think. The car's really clean. He's got a couple small little issues with it that we're going to go over, but overall it's a really nice car and it drives really well. I kind of don't really want to show you the plates, but we'll pull it out afterwards and get a better look at it. Of course, it's pissing rain here today as usual, and the car's kind of still covered in water just because I've got some things moved around finally. First, we're going to do this CV axle. He's got a replacement axle inside the car. I'm going to dig it out, get the left front wheel off, and then we'll see exactly what we're involved with changing out the left front CV. So I've got the left front wheel off, and like most front CV shafts on all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive units, you have to let the suspension go so that you can pull it out far enough to actually get the shaft to pull out from the hub. So that's basically what we're going to have to do here. The center nut will have to come off. Over here we'll have to disconnect the tie rod and drop it down. And then underneath the ball joint as well. I'm thinking I may actually, it's kind of hard to keep with the light on there. Thinking I might be able to actually let these nuts go, and I would imagine the ball joint's in the steering knuckle a little bit, and it might be able to force it down. Then I won't have to touch the actual nut with the cotter pin. Even though I could probably get it apart here and split it, probably just going to let these go and see if it'll come apart that way. Once all that's done, I'll be able to pull this out and get the shaft to go through. There's some nuts on the inner joint, and then it should just come off, but we'll see when we get there. So basically, so far, this thing is just kind of falling apart. I mean, tapping that spindle, that tie rod just fell out. All the hardware came off really nicely. I almost didn't even need the bar to break loose the control arm. I could almost force it down by hand. Like you can see, there's not a lot of tension on it, so I can actually pull it down by hand. But there's still something that's preventing me from pulling the steering knuckle out far enough for getting the CV to actually come out of the center of the hub, and that is the sway bar link, or the anti-roll bar end link. It is 14 mil and it's attached to the steering knuckle, so hopefully the nut just comes off this end link. I just realized it does have a little hex on the back side so you can actually hold it, which, you know, if you've been in the industry, you know how many end links don't have something that you can hold. So this should zap right off. No problem. Now, so you have the CV shaft. You can see the split boot. Finally out of the steering knuckle, so now I just got to unbolt those inner bolts. I believe they're 12 or 14s. I think they're 12s actually, and there's probably 6 of them. 3 points where there's 2 each. And if I just sit this like this, as soon as I get them unbolted, CV shaft's out. Next, I actually think it's probably easier to slide underneath of the car. And if I just kind of take the camera under here, you can get a good look at the CV axle right there, the bolts. So I think I'm actually going to wrench these out because there's not a lot of room to pass through even a swivel socket with an extension. So I think, yeah, I'm just going to try and wrench these, turn the axle, wrench out the other 4, and then it should just fall off. So now that I got the inner bolts, all 6 of them undone, the shaft is pretty much fallen off of the stub, and it should just come out of here just like a so. So he's had some noise, and obviously the boot is ripped on this end. It definitely sounds like it's scoring inside. I don't know if that click should be that much. Obviously it's sitting on a retaining ring. But let's put in the new shaft. So here is what I suppose is just a reman shaft. It's just a used shaft that someone's installed some new boots on and re-lubed, obviously. It didn't come with the nut, so I'm going to have to reuse the nut. And the threads look pretty good. Nothing serious. And it's the right shaft. It's the left-hand side shaft. It is the correct shaft. The other side actually has just a regular stub, so you don't actually have to unbolt the right-hand side. Might be a little bit quicker job. It's hard to say, but let's slide this guy in. And once I usually have it relatively sitting in place like that, I can just go in on the underside and start putting those bolts back in. And actually those bolts were not very tight at all. They were tight, it's not like they were loose, but just 2 wrenches and just a quick little oomph and they were apart no problem. So there's not a lot of torque to them, and I don't recommend a lot of torque if you don't have this torque spec like me. I just plan on tightening them very evenly, and I don't think there'll be any issue with that at all. Obviously having the torque spec would be the best way. I am going to need it for the CV shaft so that we get the proper torque on the wheel bearing. So I've definitely got to look up that spec. But even just getting a torque wrench on the inner 6 bolts is a little bit more difficult, and I think just tightening them by hand will be perfectly fine. Okay, now that I have the axle completely bolted in on the inner joint, I can pull out the steering knuckle and pass the stub end of the shaft through the hub, and then we're just basically ready to reverse everything that we took apart and tighten it all up. I do have to get some torque specs, and so I think I'm just going to kind of whip this together because it's pretty simple. Not that I'm trying to not show you guys stuff, but I've already done a couple of jobs like this in the past. And even though this is kind of a how-to, reasonably I think you've got everything. It's just the 2 stud bolts that hold the ball joint, the tie rod, the axle nut, and the sway bar nut, which is actually quite easy and simple to get off, so pretty standard stuff. Now I do actually still tend to always tighten front end components with a wrench by hand. That way I can really make a judgment on how tight it actually is and to make sure it's fully seated. This tie rod is probably should have a washer backed up onto it, but another thing is if you're doing a lot of repair work, it's always good to have one of these containers of cotter pins. You can use one of the big ones for the axle to replace that one, and just probably a standard 1/8 for the tie rod right here. So with everything tightened back up, the last thing is the axle nut. Now I was just able to look up the spec. It is 166 foot-pounds. So what I'm going to do is put on 2 of the wheel nuts and turn this to the point where I can jam my pry bar. Between the 2 wheel studs like so. You may have seen me do this before. Got my torque wrench, 166. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier was sizes. So we need 36 mil for the axle nut. It's a 19 mil for the tie rod and the ball joint nuts. And then 14 mil for the sway bar link and 12 mil for the inner axle joint. So 166 foot-pounds. Got the pry bar set up. And now that that's set, we can put on that little retaining washer, and I think we're going to put in a new cotter pin. And there we are, CV axles installed. Just have to replace the wheel. Factory torque on the wheel nuts is 87 foot-pounds. Probably take these wheels up to 95 because they are pretty wide. He's running 255s on this car, I believe. But that's basically it. I'll get the wheel back on, drop it down, and we'll finish up. So yeah, hopefully installing that shaft takes care of the noise that he suspected to be a CV axle. He was getting a kind of a clicking noise on turns from what I know, and just, you know, intermittent clicking in the front, which seemed to be driveline related. So oftentimes the CV axle will do that. There was a little bit of clicking play in that outer joint. I think it's basically on the retaining clip, but it could be wrong. And I do realize that everyone would love to see me jump in the car, start it, rev it up, and head down the road. We will get there. It's just not going to happen this weekend. The car is going to be coming back. Tyler needs to get it tuned, and the tuner wants leak down and compression numbers, or compression and leak down. I'm pretty sure that we're going to go there next and pull the plugs, pull the ignition apart, and do those tests, just so we've got a good breakdown of how healthy this thing is. As far as I understand, and Tyler knows, this is pretty much a built engine. It's just basically running stock power levels at this point. So the car will be coming back in. There's going to be more videos on it. I do need to get back to my S13 myself. I think I got all the ignition figured out on that, so it's running really well, and I've started on a lot of the body parts, but I'm not really ready to show you guys that stuff yet, and there'll probably be a couple videos on this. We'll switch to the S13 and then hopefully back to the Impreza eventually. So if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here and you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button for me. Leave your questions and comments further down below, and I'll see you in the next one.